And Warren Buffett, one of the world's richest men and considered by many the greatest private investor of all time, was asked what did he look for in his new employees, and he said there aren't but three things: intelligence, energy, and integrity. And without integrity, the other two don't matter. Fred Pancoast was an obscure football coach here, an assistant to Coach Dooley, before he was hired to go up to Vanderbilt to try to build a winning program. After several years of diligent effort, he couldn't do it. And disgruntled alumni offered to buy out his contract if he would simply quit. He called a news conference and he said, Vanderbilt University can fire its football coach, but he cannot be bought. It's a generalized epithet that all recognize, as honest persons do not lie, cheat, and steal. And in his book, Integrity, Professor Carter illustrated that one cannot have integrity without being honest. But an honest person can lack integrity altogether. Think about that. Walter Lippmann concluded that one has virtue who can respond to a situation that is larger than a mere inclination, who can hold himself to an ideal of conduct when it is inconvenient or unprofitable to do so. General George Marshall was leader of the American Army stationed in Washington, D.C. from 1939 to 1945, and the Allies gave him extensive credit for the victory both in Europe and in the Pacific. After that, at the end of the war, he became Secretary of State under President Truman. He became a principal thinker and a leader of the 1947 plan for European recovery that we later and now know as the Marshall Plan. It's considered one of the greatest of the nation's acts of diplomacy and foreign policy. And it enabled our former enemies to rebuild broken economies and prevent the Soviets from absorbing Western Europe. Marshall himself revealed the plan up at Harvard. He drove up there by himself, unaccompanied by staff or reporters. When he got up to speak, he took a folded piece of paper from his pocket and he read it calmly, his government's massive intentions. When he retired in 1947, publishers came running with offers of enormous sums for his memoirs. He declined them outright, and he had his reasons, he said. It would not do to call attention to himself, and the memoirs would require him to comment upon colleagues, both men and women, and cause them pain who during the war did the best they could. And finally, he said, I'm declining your offer because my country has fully compensated me for my services. Reverend Billy Graham preached one time that if you lose your wealth, you've lost nothing. If you lose your health, you've lost something. And if you lose your character, you've lost everything. Professor Freelick up at Rutgers University Law School used to teach his students that integrity is a character trait of a lifetime. And many people agree with that. The editors of the New York Times concluded a long time ago that integrity is the first great virtue, and without it, all others turn to sand. It's small wonder, because integrity generates two priceless intangibles: trustworthiness and rock-solid reputation. And bound up with those are reliability, accountability, square dealing, and a commitment to standards and ideals. We know it when we see it, but defining it is another matter. And if I were to ask for definitions here from the club, I predict I would get a dozen. Other great virtues like wisdom and moderation and justice invoke vivid mental impressions. But in the abstract, integrity is vague, it's elusive, and it's thick with effects. And so I ask you here today 3 questions. What is the real essence of individual and professional integrity and business integrity? What unseen forces motivate it? And what elements direct its practice? And I can assure you that these questions do have answers, and all we have to do is distill them. In a letter to the Wall Street Journal, a fellow named Walt Gardner of Los Angeles averred that in 2008, Wall Street was where integrity went to die. When Secretary of State Cyrus Vance resigned as Secretary of State because he could no longer enforce the foreign policy of the Carter administration, a journalist wrote, "You can put Vance's name next to the dictionary definition of integrity." But if you look, you will see that Mr. Webster is of limited help. I respectfully submit to you, it's people of integrity who give us the best guidance. We readily recognize those who will stand alone, and we mark those who are unintimidated by the desire for approval and some neurotic need for security. Eugene V. Debs was a social agitator on the American scene in the early decades of the last century. He was thrown in jail in Ohio for demonstrating against small children working in dangerous coal mines. And while he was incarcerated, he received a telegram, and it read, "Stand by your principles regardless of the consequences. Your mother and father." Debs held fast and became a major factor in the reform of this country's child labor laws. Integrity is commonly interchanged with honesty, but they're not one and the same thing. Honesty is a generalized epithet. It means what all of us know: the person will not lie, cheat, or steal. Professor Carter up at the Harvard Law School wrote a book on integrity, and in that he had concluded that an honest person can lack integrity altogether. Think about that. It's often used and interchanged with courage, but it too is a distinct virtue. And courage requires a threat and a prospective harm, either physical or psychological. But that's not the same thing with integrity. It emanates from a choice and the actions that follow that choice. But across the centuries, it has evolved, and today we see it in a new light, and we see it as the adherence to one's convictions. We distinguish it as a loyalty to one's own judgment, opinions, and standards. When you pare it down to bedrock, it's the capacity to stand by an idea in the face of the temptation to let it go.